doing the causes of American imperialism. We're going to learn about the economic and cultural factors that shaped American foreign policy at the turn of the century. So we talked about Teddy Roosevelt and the Progressive Era and kind of everything that led up to this, and now we're going to talk about basically Teddy Roosevelt and McKinley and some other presidents and what their foreign policy is. Okay? Our central question here is, why does the United States feel the need to become an imperial power?
So chapter 18, beginning of course with 18.1, like Mr. Manelsky mentioned, is going to backtrack a little bit. In chapter 17, we got all the way up to the 19 teens with Woodrow Wilson's presidency and his progressive reforms. We talked about Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. Now, because World War II is on the horizon in the 19 teens, we're going to backtrack a little bit and begin to talk about American expansion during this time. And of course, chapter 18 with this expansion and foreign wars will segue nicely into World War I. So, the United States of America at the end of the 1800s have fulfilled their idea of manifest destiny. Remember, throughout the 17 and 1800s, the U.S. believed that they had God's given right to expand all the way to the Pacific Ocean and take up all of that land. And of course, that led to acquiring many different territories. But once we had acquired all these territories and spread to the Pacific, people began to look towards Europe and towards Asia and realized that the next step for the United States of America is to expand internationally and expand throughout the oceans.
The Europeans have been doing that, right? So European nations, Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Spain, all of them have been basically carving up. So after all the colonies in the Americas kind of declared their independence in the first half of the 1800s, the second half of the 1800s are these European nations trying to rebuild their empires in Africa and Asia, right? So France and England take huge portions of the African continent under their control. Britain moves into India, most notably, and takes control of India and what today would be Pakistan, plus many islands and stuff and other territories throughout the Asia and other areas, right? So come with the saying, the sun never sets in the British Empire, right? That no matter where you were in the world, that there was British possessions in there.
Yeah, and it wasn't just European imperialism, there was Asian imperialism too. Japan is beginning to imperialize China. You also have Britain, Russia, Germany, France. They are all trying to get a piece of China and China's trade market. And so the United States not only begins to look towards what Europe is doing, but also begins to see what's going on in Asia. America also tried to seek trade opportunities with China, and by the end of chapter 18, we will actually have annexed the Hawaiian Islands and the Filipino Islands and Guam and Samoa and Puerto Rico, and we will have trade rights in China. So you can sort of see which direction this chapter is moving towards.
Okay, so there's a couple of reasons that we want to move out and do this, right? And the first one is to compete economically with Britain and France and other developed European nations, right? If we wanted to be a dominant economic power, we would have to have colonies and an empire to kind of support them, right? We need it's markets for goods being produced, it's raw materials coming in, right? Remember learning, it's almost like mercantilism, right? The same kind of principle that you have a market for your goods being produced in your country.
Yep, there's also political and military competition, including a strong navy. Alfred T. Mahan wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon Nations at this time, wrote it in 1890. And basically what he's arguing is that all of these strongest nations in the world for the past 150 years have done the same thing. They've developed a very strong navy, and that navy protects their shipping lanes. So that way they're able to colonize in areas all over the world and protect the trade and the new markets they're opening up to. So developing a strong navy is something that's going to be essential to America's expansion, and that's exactly what we do. But we can't just justify expanding to these lands through an economic justification, because you will get many people pushing back, saying that America has plenty of raw materials, they have plenty of market, they don't need to be taking over these other countries against their will. So of course there was a moralizing spin to this imperialism. The ideas of social Darwinism now came into play again, except not for big business, but for at home, but big business abroad. And they said that because we are so civilized and because we are Christian, we actually owe it to these other nations to go out and help them become civilized and help them become Christianized. When they die, they can go to heaven and live on forever.
Yeah, if the political and economic justifications for it and still don't convince everyone, just say that you're going to save their souls, and that'll normally get the last stragglers on board.
That usually helps. Most of them, at least. There were still many people, and we'll talk about this, there were still many people that were against these ideas. But we'll get more into that in a moment.
Right, again, this goes on with the economic competition. It's getting a favorable balance of trade, right? That means that you're exporting more value than you are importing, right? So that means there's money coming into your nation. That's generally a good thing. You hear about like Trump talking about how we're losing to China and losing to Mexico. He's talking about we have an unfavorable balance of trade. Right? So that's kind of the perspective. But you can see the United States is exporting a lot more goods after the Civil War, towards the end of the 1900s. Right? Lots and lots and lots of money. It's going out and going to new markets, going to Europe, going to these colonies. That's making a lot of people in America very wealthy.
So, like I mentioned, there were many people that were anti-imperialistic, and some of them were extremely well-known politicians or authors, public figures at this time. And there were two major reasons why people were against imperialism. Number one, these territories that we were taking over, the situation we were putting them in was really not fair to them. We were basically taking advantage of their manpower, taking advantage of their natural resources, forcing them to help America become more wealthy, but in turn not giving them the constitutional protections that they actually deserved. And so we sort of have to put our money where our mouth is. If we're saying that we're going out to help these people, then we should give them constitutional protection. Additionally, we had built 9 brand new warships at this time. The Navy was churning out very expensive warships, and many people recognized that there were still a lot of domestic problems in the United States during this time period, and we shouldn't be spending all of our money going out abroad to try and control native populations that didn't want us, to try and protect shipping and trading lanes that we don't actually need. And they argue that this money can be spent better domestically in the United States, and that we should not imperialize other nations.
Right, our first big kind of acquisition for the Spanish-American War, which we'll talk about in the next sections, is Hawaii. Okay? Hawaii is like an independent monarchy. There's a lot of American businessmen, like Sanford Dole. You ever seen Dole fruits, like a banana? If you look at the stickers in the banana grocery store, right? He owns a lot of basically plantations, kind of farms in Hawaii, growing fruit and things that he exports to the United States. He doesn't like the policies of the Queen of Hawaii. And
Queen Lily Ukulani.
Yeah, I was going to let Mr. Caldwell say that because
I got it.
I don't
nailed
think I know how to say it, right?
Yeah.
And they're these kind of rich American landowners overthrow the Queen because they don't like her policies on trade with the United States. McKinley decides to basically, oh, that's very nice. Thank you for giving me Hawaii, and will annex Hawaii into the United States.
So what happens here, just to sort of plug some holes, because you might be wondering, well, how did this all happen? The United States of America had been receiving trade from Hawaii since actually the late 1700s, as crazy as that is to think about. And by the mid-1900s or 1800s, 19th century, around the time of the Civil War, white landowners had moved into Hawaii, basically monopolized all of the land, and believe it or not, actually were shipping in immigrants from Japan and Portugal and China to work this land, to the point where white landowners and immigrants from Asia way outnumbered the native Hawaiians. Because of that, the king, Kalukai at the time, decided to give the white property owners the vote. Only they could vote. So basically, they had totally taken over the government, and they were shipping out sugar to the United States and making a huge profit off of it, because at this time, they could get sugar with no tax. So what eventually happens is the U.S. strong-arms Hawaii into allowing us to build a naval base. A tariff is passed in the United States that now puts a tax on Hawaiian sugar. The white landowners are really angry, and they argue that the U.S. should annex Hawaii. Grover Cleveland didn't think it was the right thing to do if the natives didn't want it. But when McKinley became president, like Mr. Minelski mentioned, he decided to annex Hawaii. The one person who stood against this is Queen Liliuokalani, who actually became queen in 1891, and she fought hard to take the voting rights from just the property owners to all of the natives. And like Mr. Minelski mentioned, that's when America basically came in. The U.S. ambassadors and volunteer armies came in, overthrew the queen, imprisoned her in her own palace, and it was a valiant effort, but of course she lost to the great power and greed of the United States of America.
Part of it's got to remember, like, these are not balanced fights, right? I mean, we're going into countries that are underdeveloped, don't have the technology, don't have the population to compete with a major industrialized nation. And that's one of the big arguments against it, is that it's so wildly unfair to these smaller countries. Like, Hawaii cannot compete with the United States as a military power.
And real quick, in case you have a question with the McKinley Tariff, I want to reinforce, because I think I just said it in passing. The McKinley Tariff was a tariff that was passed that did tax that sugar from Hawaii. So now all of a sudden the white landowners are not getting their sugar sent to America with no tax. Therefore, there's more competition, especially in the late 1890s when America's also getting sugar from Cuba. Because of that, that's when the business owners plead to America, please annex us, because if they officially become part of the United States, then they don't have to pay a tax on foreign goods.
It destabilizes the